Chapters 11 and 12 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 11. 1808 to 1809. The Peninsula Campaign. On his return from Erfurt, Napoleon remained only 10 days at St. Cloud, and then left to place himself at the head of his troops in Spain. He was in haste to put down the insurrection there before Austria had time to begin the war which, in spite of her pacific assertions, seemed imminent. In September, one of his armies was closely invested at Barcelona, and the forces of Joseph, reduced to 50,000 men, were holding the line of the Ebro. But the fresh troops called from Germany were arriving daily. The Spanish forces were much dispersed. Blake, with 50,000 men, was on the left, and Castaños with 40,000 at the right. In second line there were 20,000 men around Saragossa, and as many more at Burgos, with a reserve corps of 10,000 men at Madrid. Finally there was an English army of 25,000 men ready to disembark. By the end of October, Napoleon had 200,000 men ready to march into Spain, about half taken from Italy and southern France, and 5 corps brought back from Germany. The Emperor reached Bayonne on the 3rd November, crossed the frontier the next day, and joined his headquarters at Vittoria. Immediately on his arrival the troops were set in motion. His strategy was a repetition of the maneuver of Austerlitz on a larger scale. He broke the Spanish center at Burgos, then turned against the two wings, which were easily beaten and dispersed. The road to Madrid was now open, and the capital surrendered on the 4th December. In the meantime, the English army under Sir John Moore had advanced on Burgos. Napoleon immediately left Madrid with the Guard and Ney's corps to cut off Moore's retreat, while Soult held him in front. But Moore learned of his danger in time, and made good his escape. Napoleon then turned over the pursuit to Soult and Ney, who followed the English to the coast and drove the remnants of the army back on their ships. Moore was killed, and the British lost all their baggage and supplies. The genius of Napoleon had apparently triumphed, as usual. In 4 weeks he had reconquered all the north of Spain, vanquished and dispersed all the regular forces, and reinstated his brother in the capital. These results seemed immense; in reality they amounted to nothing at all. The whole country was in insurrection. Small guerrilla bands formed in the rear of the French advance and seriously interrupted the system of communications. The French held only the ground they occupied; outside that the country was in flames. With an entire misunderstanding of the Spanish character, Napoleon tried to overcome this opposition by bestowing on the nation the benefits of an enlightened legislation. The day of his entry into the capital, the Inquisition was abolished, 2/3 of the convents suppressed, feudal rights annulled, the barriers between the provinces thrown down. Napoleon wished to confer upon Spain a reign of order in place of chaos, the light of the 19th century instead of the darkness of the Middle Ages, but the people did not understand his reforms, and would have none of them. The clergy, the monks, the grandees, saw in the decrees of the Emperor even greater perils than in the change of dynasty. The mistake which Napoleon made in trying to place his brother on the throne was nothing in comparison with the suppression of the Inquisition, the convents and feudal rights. The wrath of the clergy and the grandees fanned the popular flame. Savage and implacable, the ignorant people rose as one man to repel those who would have relieved them from oppression. On the 1st day of January, 1809, near Astorga, Napoleon received a courier from Paris, bringing the news of the continued armament of Austria, and of the intrigues of Talleyrand and Fouché. He decided to leave at once for home. It was on this occasion that he performed the remarkable feat, for a man of his age, of galloping from Valladolid to Burgos, a distance of 30 leagues, in 6 hours, his horses being arranged in 6 relays. He arrived at Bayonne on the morning of the 19th January, and at the Tuileries 4 days later. Before leaving Spain, Napoleon made the mistake of entrusting the chief command of his army to Joseph, with Marshal Jourdan as chief of staff and adviser. Joseph had no military capacity, and the marshals paid no attention to his orders. Arrogant and insubordinate, these generals fought only for their own glory, instead of the common cause. For the interests of France, the absence of the Emperor from Spain was not only a military disaster, but also a civil misfortune, as he alone had the prestige and the ability to prepare and accomplish the pacification of the interior, and organize the administration of the kingdom. During the absence of the Emperor in Spain, a plot had been formed in case of his death to place Murat on the throne. At the head of this conspiracy were those arch traitors, Fouche and Talleyrand. In former days these two men had been declared enemies. To Talleyrand, Fouche had owed his first disgrace, and he had showed his contempt of his rival on every occasion. All of a sudden, however, Talleyrand appeared in the salon of Fouche, and the latter was seen at the receptions of the Vice Grand Electeur. They were seen walking arm in arm, and after a rupture of 10 years, appeared to be on most cordial terms. Perhaps they did not actually hope to see the Emperor perish by the knife of a fanatical monk, or the bullet of a guerrilla, but if such a catastrophe arrived, they intended to be prepared. Murat was advised by his wife, who was at Paris, to have relays of horses arranged from Naples to the capital, so as to lose no time when he was called. The day of his return, Napoleon sent for his ministers to meet him at the Tuileries, and in their presence severely rebuked Talleyrand for his course. Of late years the Emperor had rarely forgotten his dignity in the face of witnesses, but on this occasion his wrath seemed to increase from moment to moment, and the cold impassibility of Talleyrand caused him entirely to lose his self-control. Following Talleyrand, who retreated without uttering a word to the wall of the room, Napoleon shook his fist and cried, "And you deny the part which you took in the condemnation of the Duc d'Enghien? And you dare to say that you had nothing to do with the affairs of Spain?" Encountering no resistance from this man of marble, the wrath of Napoleon gradually subsided, and he became calm again. But the Emperor took no further action beyond that of dismissing the prince from his office of Grand Chamberlain. After making an implacable enemy of Talleyrand, Napoleon left him still in a position of influence. Once more he failed to follow the wise axiom of Frederick: never maltreat an enemy by halves. Napoleon's leniency for the Minister of Police was even more inexplicable. Feeling, perhaps, that his usefulness outweighed his defects, the Emperor displayed no resentment toward him. Of course Caroline was forgiven. Napoleon's indulgence for the faults and crimes of his family never knew any limits. On his way home from Erfurt, Alexander passed 2 days at Königsberg with the royal family of Prussia, and left them convinced that under certain circumstances he would make their cause his own. A few days later, at Miteaux, he arranged a marriage between the Princesse Sophie Dorothée de Courlande, the future Duchesse de Dinaud, and a nephew of the Prince de Bénévent. He thus paid Talleyrand the price of his treason. Caulaincourt, who returned with the Czar, and who was ignorant of the relations of Talleyrand with the courts of Russia and Austria, kept up his correspondence with the former minister, and in one of his letters we read: "The Emperor often condescends to demand news of you, and honors with a constant interest the family he has given you." In parting with Napoleon, Alexander had arranged to send Rumensoff for a time to Paris as special ambassador, to follow with Champagny the negotiations for peace with England. Tolstoy had been ordered to join the army on the Danube, and Rumensoff, while retaining his ministerial functions, was to replace him, pending the arrival of the new ambassador, Prince Kurakin. In order to bind closer the ties of his alliance, Napoleon spared no pains to win the new ambassador. Rumensoff was fond of literature and art, so all the collections and museums of Paris were thrown wide open for him, and orders were given to prepare for him a library of rare works. The Emperor wished him to enjoy his visit, and prolong it as much as possible. During the absence of the Emperor in Spain, Austria had hastened her preparations for war. The reserves, called out only for exercise and instruction, were still mobilized. The government still refused to recognize the new kings; and the French ambassador, André Aussy, formerly treated as a suspicious person, was now regarded as an enemy. The court of Vienna, it is true, had sent back to Paris the former ambassador Metternich, who had been absent several months. When Champagny asked if he brought the recognition of Joseph and Murat, his reply was very hesitating and confused. "I must say to your Majesty," wrote the Minister of Foreign Affairs, under date of 3rd January, 1809, "that I have never seen Monsieur de Metternich, who is usually at his ease and most matter of fact, so embarrassed in his expressions and so confused in his language." From this interview Champagny carried away the conviction that Austria was only awaiting the propitious moment to begin hostilities. From all the frontiers the French agents reported that she was pushing her preparations with feverish haste. From Valladolid, before leaving Spain, the Emperor himself gave some orders for the concentration of his troops. He reinforced the corps left in Germany, ordered one to approach the Danube, and called on the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine to complete their quotas. He also sent Eugene a plan for the defense of Italy, and ordered his guard to take the route for France. These measures, for the moment, were only precautionary. Napoleon still counted on Alexander to contain and paralyze Austria. As he was ignorant of the treacherous conversations between the Czar and Talleyrand at Erfurt, and the disclosures of the latter to Metternich, he could not understand the confidence with which Austria continued her preparations. On his way to rejoin the army, Tolstoy had passed through Vienna, and had seized the opportunity to display his anti-French sentiments. With the greatest assurance he guaranteed the friendly disposition of Russia; and from his former position his words took almost an official character. Notwithstanding all of his rebuffs at Erfurt, Napoleon had not yet given up the idea of persuading Alexander to menace Austria. One of the many reasons for his precipitate return to Paris was the hope of finding Rumentzoff at the capital. Convinced of the uselessness of the overtures for peace made to England, the Russian ambassador had announced his departure. The English government, in reply to the joint note of the emperors, had given the assurance that it desired peace, and was ready to enter into negotiations provided the Spanish government, acting in the name of Ferdinand VII, took part. This was tantamount to refusing all negotiations, for they well knew that Napoleon would never accept this condition. Before leaving Spain, Napoleon had sent a special courier to St. Petersburg, charged with 2 letters, one for Alexander, conveying his wishes for a happy new year, and the other for Caulaincourt, ordering him to impress upon the Czar the urgent necessity of a joint note to Austria, in order to avert hostilities. That government was to be summoned peremptorily to discontinue its warlike preparations, and if the response were not favorable, the French and Russian ambassadors were to demand their passports at once. To Eugene, to his brother Jérôme, and to the South German sovereigns, at the same time, Napoleon writes in a tone of confidence which could hardly have been sincere. He claims that his relations with Russia had never been closer; that the Czar cannot understand the attitude of Austria, and is very indignant about her conduct; that if the Emperor Francis makes the first hostile movement he will soon have ceased to reign. He apparently hoped that the echo of these fulminations would reach Vienna, and cause the Austrian government to draw back at the last moment. His letters to Joséphine are also couched in the same terms of assurance. His dominating thought was to use the fear of Russia to terrify Austria and paralyze her efforts. 60 years later, on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, Bismarck used exactly the same tactics to keep Austria out of the fray, and with perfect success. Before returning to their capital, which the French troops had now evacuated, Frederick William and Queen Louisa went to St. Petersburg, to return the visits which Alexander had made to them at Berlin in 1805, and more recently at Königsberg. It is difficult to state whether they took this step upon their own initiative, or at the invitation of the Czar. However this may be, they had a splendid reception at the Russian capital, and were treated at Petersburg as if Prussia had gained the Battle of Jena. In visiting St. Petersburg, the Prussian sovereigns had evidently counted upon the grace and beauty of Queen Louisa to have their usual effect upon the susceptible heart of Alexander. Their hopes were all the greater because for some months there had seemed to be a coldness between Alexander and the woman who had reigned over his affections for so many years, la belle Narishkin. The absence of the favorite had seemed to bring about a reconciliation between the Czar and his wife, and restore to the Empress all her rights. These rumors evidently reached the ears of Napoleon, for in his letter of the 14th January we read: "Will your Majesty permit me to wish you good health, and a fine little autocrat of all the Russias?" The King and Queen arrived on the 7th January, and were received by the Czar with full military honors. The garrison of 45,000 men was under arms, and lined the streets. At the Winter Palace the visitors had a warm welcome from the two empresses. Louisa was delighted to find in her rooms "a dozen dresses of every kind in the best taste, and of the greatest richness," and Caulaincourt relates in his On Dit that the malicious gossips of the capital whispered that these gifts were the main object of the royal visit. During the following days there was a succession of dinners, concerts, balls, and fetes of every kind. Public business, as Caulaincourt complains in his despatches, was entirely suspended. The French ambassador was received by the King and Queen, not at the head of the diplomatic corps, but alone and privately, and he was the only one to give them a grand ball in his sumptuous hotel, where toute la terre defiled before the portrait of Napoleon. The anxiety of Caulaincourt over this visit was unnecessary, for the Prussian sovereigns gained no political advantage. Every one made fun of the awkward airs of the King in his shako and faded uniform. Louisa tried in vain to overcome the unfavorable impression made by her husband. The trials of her life had affected her health and ruined her beauty. She inspired sympathy, but no enthusiasm. Caulaincourt summed up the general impression in the words: "The Queen is no longer considered beautiful, although she does everything in her power to appear so." Alexander, as usual, was gallant, but it was evident that his homage was rendered to the unfortunate Queen rather than the beautiful woman. Besides, the old favorite, Madame Narishkin, had now returned, and was present at all the fetes. His heart was again conquered. In striking contrast with Louisa, who was always richly dressed and covered with diamonds, Madame Narishkin was simply robed, and wore no ornaments, but she put in her handsome dark tresses some flowers of "Ne m'oubliez pas." A few days after the departure of the Prussian sovereigns, Alexander received the note of Napoleon calling upon him to take joint diplomatic action regarding Austria. It was a thunderclap from a sky in which the Czar obstinately refused to perceive any clouds. He was much disturbed over this appeal to render his alliance effective, and did not receive Caulaincourt until he had taken time for reflection. Then his attitude is thus stated in the report of the ambassador: "The hope of terminating political differences as one arranges a family quarrel flatters the philanthropic spirit of the Emperor to the point where no argument changes the base of his opinion." After discussing the matter fully with Caulaincourt, the Czar sent his reply to Paris. He agreed to make a joint demand on Austria to disarm, or at least to make an explanation, but his note did not contain the menace which alone could have changed the purpose of Austria and have averted the war. At the same time he wrote a long letter to Rumenzoff, all in his own hand, in pencil as usual, in which he displays his good will, but obstinately persists in his error as to the intentions of Austria. At the end he relates his first conversations with Schwarzenberg, the new Austrian ambassador, but is not frank enough to reveal what the latter states in his despatches to Vienna: his sympathy for Austria and his secret hostility toward Napoleon. His advice to Francis, in a word, was to wait, to temporize, to search a better occasion. The hour of vengeance would sound some day. From this report, Austria rightly inferred that the Czar would not render his ally any effective assistance in the coming struggle. 12. 1809. War with Austria. Austria had first expected to begin hostilities in the month of March, but was forced by the backwardness of her final preparations to put the date off until April. The 1st of March, Metternich received orders to advise the French government that on account of the military precautions taken in the Confederation, she was forced to place her troops upon a footing of war. The mask was off at last. Napoleon for once was taken by surprise. He wondered whether Austria was really foolish enough to begin the attack, or whether the notification was only a shrewd ruse to provoke him to take the initiative, and so absolve Alexander from the obligation to come to his assistance. In order to give Austria no pretext for war, up to the present moment, the Emperor had taken only a few precautionary measures. His corps in Germany were widely dispersed, and the contingents of the Confederation were not united. But now he commenced in earnest his preparation for the combat. With his usual activity, quick as lightning, he made his arrangements. Davout was ordered to march on Bamberg, Oudinot on Augsburg, and Massena on Ulm. In Italy, Eugene was sent to hold the right bank of the Adige. In northern Germany, on the flank of Austria, he assembled the Saxons and the Poles to cover Dresden and Warsaw. At the same time Napoleon spared no efforts to bring his ally to his aid. During the month of March, following the notification of Metternich, Champagny sent 8 urgent messages to Caulaincourt in the space of 3 weeks. Napoleon himself also wrote personal letters to Alexander and to his ambassador. To the Czar he said: "There is not a moment to be lost for your Majesty to place your troops upon the frontiers of our common enemy. I have counted upon your alliance, but it is necessary to act, and I confide in you." On the 8th of April the Emperor issued the final orders for the organization of his army. He had 6 corps under the command of Lannes, Davout, Massena, Lefebvre, Augereau, and Bernadotte, the cavalry reserve under Bessieres, and the guard, about 300,000 men in all. The Austrian army, under the command of Archduke Charles, consisted of over 300,000 troops, with 100,000 Landwehr in reserve. It was divided on the French model into 10 corps: 7 under Charles, ready to invade Bavaria; 2 under Archduke John in Italy; and 1 under Archduke Ferdinand, to enter Poland. Military skill quite apart, the odds were not uneven, but the genius of Napoleon gave the French a marked superiority. His presence on the field of battle was always regarded by the enemy as equal to an army corps of 50,000 men. Late on the evening of the 12th of April, Napoleon learned by the semaphore telegraph that the Austrians had begun the war on the 10th by crossing the Inn and invading the territory of his ally the King of Bavaria. Accompanied only by Joséphine, he left the Élysée at daybreak the following morning, and traveled directly to Strasbourg, making the 500 kilometres in exactly 48 hours. After a short rest, he crossed the Rhine to put himself at the head of his army. On the last day of March, Berthier, the Chief of Staff, had been sent from Paris to take charge of operations until the Emperor himself should reach the front. He had explicit orders, in case the Austrians invaded Bavaria, to concentrate the army behind the Lech. Great was Napoleon's dismay in arriving at Donauwörth on the morning of the 17th April, to find that Berthier had failed entirely to carry out his instructions. Charles, with nearly his entire force, was concentrated at Landshut on the Isar; while the French left wing, under Davout, was in danger of being cut off at Ratisbon, less than 30 miles to the north, and the right wing at Augsburg, 70 miles away, was equally isolated. If Charles had vigorously attacked the sparsely held French centre, he might easily have broken through, defeated in turn the 2 wings, and driven Napoleon back to the Rhine. The only thing which saved the situation was his awe of his great antagonist, which robbed him of the push and purpose that he really possessed. Yet the Archduke was a commander of high rank, and next to Wellington perhaps the greatest of Napoleon's contemporaries. Fortunately the Emperor arrived in time. In 1 day his master mind had entirely changed the conditions. Placing himself in the centre, at Ingolstadt, with the German contingents, Napoleon ordered Davout at Ratisbon and Massena at Augsburg to join him by forced marches. On the 20th of April, at Abensberg, the Emperor severely defeated the Austrians and pierced their line. The following day, at Landshut, he annihilated their left wing. Then turning back on the 22nd April, between Eckmühl and Ratisbon, he encountered the main army under Charles, who thought he had only the corps of Davout to deal with. Fighting with his usual obstinacy, that marshal held the enemy in check until Napoleon arrived on the scene with fresh troops. Although inferior in numbers, he attacked vigorously and forced the Austrians, after suffering enormous losses, to take refuge within the walls of Ratisbon. It was one of Napoleon's most brilliant victories, and to it Davout owed his title of Prince d'Eckmühl. The following day the Austrians crossed the Danube and retreated into the wilds of Bohemia. During the final attack on the city, while sitting on a hillock talking with Duroc, Napoleon was struck in the right heel by a spent bullet, about the only wound he was ever known to receive, although several scars were found on his body after his death at St. Helena. Hardly giving his surgeon, Ivan, time to treat the wound, the Emperor mounted his horse and rode along the lines, where he was greeted with enthusiastic cheers. Napoleon was always more proud of this series of manoeuvres than of any other he ever conducted. Never had he acted with more intense energy. He was always in motion, always present at the critical point, hardly taking time for food or sleep. For the last time he displayed all the activity of the days of the campaign of Italy. In his "Proclamation to the Army," issued the 24th April at Ratisbon, the Emperor stated that 40 standards, 100 cannon, and 50,000 prisoners had been taken. In conclusion he said, "Before a month we shall be in Vienna." He more than made good his prediction. On the 10th of May he slept in the palace of Schönbrunn. The appeals of Napoleon had found the Czar in his usual state of irresolution. He neither promised nor refused his cooperation. Formerly, Napoleon had put off from month to month a positive decision regarding Turkey. Now Alexander in turn had recourse to a dilatory diplomacy. He had a perfect genius for polite phrases and meaningless compliments, and to avoid committing himself he now covered Caulaincourt with his favors. More than ever he treats the ambassador as an intimate friend, and invites him to dinner 2 or 3 times a week. On these occasions he seizes every opportunity to eulogize Napoleon and France. "After dinner," says Caulaincourt in his report of the 17th March, "the Emperor condescended to call me into his cabinet." There, still in the same tone, he protested his devotion and his loyalty, but when pressed to take some action regarding Austria, once more expressed his desire to do nothing precipitate. During several weeks these scenes were repeated on every occasion. When the news finally reached St. Petersburg that Charles had crossed the Inn, that John had invaded Italy, and that Ferdinand had entered Poland at the head of 50,000 men, the ambassador officially called on the Czar for his cooperation, in accordance with the stipulations of Tilsit and Erfurt. If Alexander were to keep his plighted word, only one course was now open to him: to aid France with all his power. His perplexity was great, and he did not know which way to turn. He dreaded to see Austria crushed, and the French power increased. Above all, he feared to see the Poles arise, take possession of Galicia, and claim that province. Such an extension of the Grand Duchy would almost be equivalent to the reestablishment of Poland. With his usual foresight, Napoleon had realized that this situation might arise, and he had authorized Caulaincourt, if necessary, to sign an agreement as to the future conditions of peace, under which he bound himself not to dismember Austria or reestablish Poland. This would enable the Czar to enter the war with entire confidence that Napoleon would not abuse his victory. But Alexander was not sincere enough to embrace the opportunity. Without making any conditions, he promised Napoleon his full assistance, but at the same time secretly resolved to do nothing, and to assure Austria that he would only go through the form of combating her. No monarch ever played a more despicable double game than this young Czar, who aspired to the title of "the first gentleman of Europe." A week later, when he could hesitate no longer, Alexander declared war on Austria, promised Caulaincourt to dismiss Schwarzenberg, and to recall his legation from Vienna. At the same time he wrote to Napoleon: "Your Majesty can count on me. My resources are not very great, having 2 wars already on my hands, but everything possible shall be done. My troops are concentrated on the frontier of Galicia, and could act shortly. Your Majesty will always find in me a true ally." To the Austrian ambassador, who was not dismissed, Alexander held quite a different language. On the 15th April, he assured Schwarzenberg that he should do everything humanly possible to imagine to avoid striking a blow. 5 days later he reiterated his promises in even stronger form. He affirmed that his troops should be ordered to avoid all collisions, any acts of hostility; that furthermore their entrance into campaign should be carefully retarded. During the next few weeks, Alexander massed on the frontiers of Galicia an army of 60,000 men, under the command of Prince Galitzin, but the troops did not advance. One excuse after another was given. The season was bad, the rain persistent, the rivers overflowing, the commander detained by the marriage of his son, and so on. In default of acts, Alexander, as usual, was profuse in words. After the first victories, he was full of admiration over the valor of the French army and the genius of its commander. Why was he not at the side of Napoleon to share his glory and his dangers? As irrefutable evidence of the alliance, he wished to have the Russian uniform seen at the French headquarters, and dispatched 2 of his personal aides de camp, charged with compliments and flattering letters for the Emperor. The studied inactivity of Russia was not only a violation of her obligations under the alliance, but also detrimental to her own best interests. If the Czar had come loyally to the support of France and overrun Galicia with his troops, he would have prevented the patriotic uprising in that former province of Poland, and the danger of its annexation to the Grand Duchy, an eventuality which he dreaded above all. Austrian Galicia, more extended at that epoch than in our own times, occupying the 2 banks of the Vistula, bordered the Russian frontier for a distance of nearly 400 miles. Between the 2 countries there were no fortresses, no rivers, nothing which could impede the advance of the imperial troops. In debouching into the Grand Duchy, which lay to the north and west of Galicia, Ferdinand had left this province without garrisons or regular troops, and open to invasion. In advancing on Warsaw, he had turned his back on Galitzin, who had only to march in and take possession. The Russian army would then have been on the rear of the Archduke, and while rendering a signal service to the alliance, would have assured the Czar against the risks of the future. The Polish uprising would have been prevented, and at the conclusion of peace, Russia could have restored the province to Austria, or claimed it as the price of her cooperation. Alexander did not have long to await the result of his lack of foresight. The Polish contingent, commanded by Prince Poniatowski, was compelled to retreat before the Austrian army, which greatly outnumbered it. Warsaw was abandoned, and the troops retired behind Praga, on the right bank. In taking this direction, Poniatowski was cut off from Germany and his Saxon allies, but he remained in close touch with his compatriots in Galicia. Even before this move was suggested to him by Berthier in the name of the Emperor, he resolved on his own initiative to carry the war into Austrian territory, and relieve Warsaw under the walls of Lemberg and Cracow. The curious spectacle was then presented of the 2 adversaries turning their backs on each other and marching in opposite directions. Ferdinand to the north to menace Danzig, and the prince to the south to invade Galicia. Poniatowski entered Galicia the first week of May, and the whole country rose at his approach. Volunteers flocked to his standard from every side. The Austrian officials and the few garrisons left either surrendered or retired. No serious resistance was encountered anywhere, and Lemberg was entered on the 23rd of May. Here a provisional government was organized for the province. The news of these events created a tremendous sensation at St. Petersburg. The Czar felt that his worst fears were realized. It must be admitted that his apprehensions were justified. The agitation passed the frontiers, and a dangerous fermentation occurred in the provinces attributed to Russia in the 3 successive partitions. In some districts all the young men set out to enroll under the standard surmounted by the White Eagle, the cherished ensign of Poland. When the Czar claimed that these events could not have occurred without the approbation or the tolerance of Napoleon, Caulaincourt, with good reason, replied to his reproaches by pointing out that his own negligence and delays were the primary cause of all the trouble. Alexander was much affected by the undeniable truth of these statements, and the frankness of Caulaincourt's words, and even went so far as to embrace him when they parted. He repeated his promise that his troops should receive orders to pass the frontier. There was less excuse now for delay, as the war with Sweden was approaching an end. At the same moment the struggle between Napoleon and Austria was reaching a crisis. While the French were approaching Vienna by the right bank, the Austrian army under the Archduke Charles had marched down the opposite side of the Danube, and was now encamped in the plain of Marchfeld, almost opposite the city. In 1805 Murat had won the Floridsdorf bridge by a ruse de guerre, but this time it had been destroyed. Napoleon was forced to cross the river in order to attack the enemy, and he did not wish to give them time to fortify the positions opposite the available crossings. Below the city there is a large island called Lubau, separated from the north shore only by a narrow channel, but from the other bank by several smaller islands, among which runs the main current of the river. This seemed to be the best point for crossing, and bridges were at once thrown over. On the edge of Marchfeld, about a mile from the river, and nearly the same distance apart, were situated the villages of Aspern and Essling, which formed natural bastions. Both were solidly built of stone, and were surrounded by embankments to keep out the floods from the river. As soon as the big bridge from the south shore was finished, pontoons were thrown across the narrow arm to the north bank, and the French army began to cross over. Messina took possession of Aspern, and Lannes occupied Essling. The Archduke had laid his plans to wait until part of the French forces had crossed over, and then begin the attack. On the 21st of May, when 40,000 French had passed the river, Charles assaulted their positions with 80,000 Austrians. Aspern was taken and retaken several times, and at evening remained in the hands of the Austrians, while the French still held Essling. On the second day, when the Austrians were practically defeated, the bridges broke down for the second time, and Napoleon ordered a retreat to Lubau. The French withdrew in good order, without losing a cannon, and destroying the pontoons behind them. At the close of the battle, Lannes was struck on the knee by a cannon ball. It was found necessary to amputate his right leg, and he died at Vienna the following week. He was the first of the marshals to lose his life, and Napoleon was much affected by his death. During the following month, Napoleon was employed in bringing up his reserves and making elaborate preparations for a new crossing. On the night of the 4th of July, in stormy weather that favored his plans, 10 pontoon bridges were thrown across the narrow Stadler branch at a point further east, where the Austrians did not look for a crossing. By noon on the following day, the whole French army was in line of battle opposite the Austrian position at Wagram, some 6 miles away. Napoleon attacked at once, but owing to the lateness of the hour did not accomplish much that day. The grand tactics of the battle of the 6th July were very similar to those of Austerlitz. Davout rolled up the Austrian left wing until it stood at right angles to its earlier position. Then Napoleon broke the Austrian center by an attack which decided the fate of the day. At 2 o'clock the Austrians were in full retreat. The victory was not as decisive as Austerlitz or Jena, owing to Napoleon's failure to follow up the enemy with his usual vigor. The reasons usually given are that his men had been fighting for 30 hours; that they had been almost without sleep for 2 nights, and had suffered greatly from the heat and the lack of water. They were therefore nearly exhausted. But at the close of the battle he had in reserve Marmont's corps and the Guard, over 20,000 men, so the real explanation probably is that, as after Friedland, he did not care to harass the defeated enemy, with whom he might later wish to make friends. Charles, whose conduct of the battle had been excellent, withdrew his forces in good order. Followed by the French, he retreated to Znaim, where 5 days after the battle he proposed an armistice, which Napoleon immediately accepted. In a remarkable letter which Napoleon had Champagny write Caulaincourt, under date of the 2nd of June, the Emperor expressed his grief over the conduct of the Czar, and stated in so many words that he no longer had any confidence in the Russian alliance. A week later came the news that Galitzin had issued a proclamation announcing his intention to enter Galicia. The Emperor put this information at the head of his next bulletin. Although it might have little actual value, it would serve to encourage his troops, reassure his allies, and disconcert the Austrians. From the first he had counted more on the moral than on the material value of the alliance, to hold Germany in check and isolate England. So long as France and Russia seemed united, there was little danger of the formation of another coalition against him. Even the shadow of an entente could impose on his enemies, discourage their rising, and break their resistance. After all, the Russian alliance had its advantages. Under instructions from the Emperor, Champagny resumed the cordial effusions of Tilsit and Erfurt. Alexander had written, "Your Majesty will always find in me an ally and a faithful friend." Champagny replied, The intentions of the Emperor Alexander are known perfectly by his Majesty, who can only congratulate himself on having such a faithful ally, and I would almost venture to say, a friend so sincere." Phrase for phrase, compliment for compliment. In this difficult situation, Napoleon plays a prudent and a double game. Putting aside once more the idea of a complete restoration of Poland, as incompatible with the Russian alliance, he takes pains not to undeceive the people of Poland and of Galicia. He rewards their leaders, but takes no action which compromises him with the Czar. On the 3rd of June, nearly 2 months after the commencement of hostilities, about 45,000 Russians finally crossed the frontier and entered Galicia. At the same time, Ferdinand evacuated Warsaw, marched up the left bank of the Vistula, and took up a position opposite the Poles in Galicia. He occupied Sandomir, situated on both banks of the river, and the Poles encamped at a short distance from the same place, to await the arrival of the Russians, who would give them a great numerical superiority. But the latter advanced with exasperating slowness. However, on the 12th of June, one corps, under the command of General Prince Suvaroff, a son of the famous Russian marshal, arrived on the San, and took up a position near the Poles. The same day, the Austrians advanced to the attack, and Poniatowski, after a brave resistance, was forced to retreat. In vain he appealed to the Russians for assistance, ever going personally to their headquarters for this purpose. "Traitorous conduct!" cried Napoleon on hearing of these events. As it seemed impossible for the Poles and Russians to act in harmony, it was finally arranged that the two armies should separate, and each guard a different bank of the river. The Russians carefully avoided any conflict with the Austrians, and the only encounter between them was the result of accident. Several shots were exchanged, 1 man was killed and 2 wounded. This seems to have been the total of the Russian casualties during this bloody campaign. An Austrian officer was sent to the Russian headquarters to present his excuses for this accident. End of chapters 11 and 12.